Should I remove?
No, it's,
So this is the mic, right?
this is an example. हाँ ठीक है, everything is good. अभी वीडियो भी है, वीडियो भी. हाँ good. Greetings everyone. Good morning to all of you who are in India, and greetings to others. As many of you know, we have been conducting a series of seminars, webinars, and workshops to have some discussions on research and analytics in trade policy here at NITI Aayog. In that series, we are very excited to have Dr. Sanjay Kathuria and Dr. Srinivasan today. In the recent couple of years, we have seen a very detailed engagement of India with different countries in terms of free trade agreements. Negotiations are going on. Couple of countries have been concluded. Many others are going on. So UK is a very important partner in that regard, and there has been a lot of negotiations going on, and we expect them to conclude in the near future. So in this regard, a question arises as to whether this FTA is it more of something like a low-hanging fruit that is done so that we are all happy for now, or is it a much deeper engagement? Dr. Kathuria and Dr. Srinivasan are going to discuss this topic, and they have done some analysis and research they are going to explain. And we are also fortunate to have Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, who will be a discussant here. He'll explain his thoughts and viewpoints on this. So just to give a brief introduction about the speakers today, Dr. Sanjay Kathuria is a long-time executive at World Bank. So he was a lead economist at the World Bank before. Currently, he holds the position of a senior visiting fellow at Center for Policy Research here, and he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and also Ashoka University. And Dr. T.G. Srinivasan also has been a long-time World Banker, if I can use the term. And in the recent times, he has been also a senior visiting fellow at Center for Policy Research. So over to both of you, Dr. Kathuria and Dr. Srinivasan.
Thank you. Thank you, Badri, and thank you for this opportunity to host Dr. Srinivasan and myself. So I want to thank, to begin with, also, apart from TG and myself, with two young scholars, we started this work, Prachi Agarwal and Vishaka Burman, who have now gone on to greener pastures overseas, but they were very much part of our when we started this engagement. So there is a lot of credit to them as well. So let me sort of get going now, and with the preamble that this is the third proposed foreign free trade agreement of India, and in coming rapidly on the heels of first the UAE and then Australia. We don't know too much about the details of this agreement, but we can have pretty educated guesses based on what has transpired with Australia and the UAE. So we've titled it as, is it another early harvest, as Badri, you started saying, or is there opportunity for dynamic gains? So this is how we're going to structure our presentation. We will start with just talking about relative economic strengths of India and the UK. What are some of the bilateral trade patterns? What is the context and the imperatives for UK and India to get into these agreements? Then we'll get into the free trade impact on trade and investment. Once you have concluded an agreement, we will present some the results done by the UK on high and low depth integration. Then we look at some sector issues on Mode 4 and investment, and what are India's concerns in different sectors. Then we'll talk about a more long-term approach to trade liberalization. What a more perhaps a first best approach to trade liberalization might look like, a thought on India's neighbors, on the impact on India's neighbors, and then finally conclude. Okay, so let's start with the relative economic strengths of India and the UK. So as this chart will show us, so India is just, as we know, a lot of fanfare. India just nosed ahead of the UK in GDP terms, if you look at the latest quarterly data. But in either case, there are two very large economies, the fifth and sixth largest economies in the world, purely in nominal dollar terms. The UK is a big outward investor, much larger than India, 4 or 5 times India's outward investment, which is a very important point for the partnership. And also it is a global leader in innovation, right? So it is ranked 4th in innovation. So that's, again, something very important to keep in mind as we continue into this discussion. So what are some of the bilateral trade patterns, right? So what is easy to understand is that India runs consistent trade surpluses with the UK, both in goods and services, for the last 20 odd years, and so this is a pretty consistent pattern. And what is also true is that the UK's market share in India has fallen, both in terms of exports as well as imports. In terms of shares of India's, in fact, the market share has fallen faster in terms of share in India's goods imports than its share of India's exports. And the reason for the former is that China essentially has now a dominant position in India's imports, and therefore all other countries' share has fallen relative to China. Yeah. So a little bit more detail about, this is from the OEC Atlas of Economic Complexity, which all trade wonks will be very familiar with. This is charts out the changing structure of exports. So what it's a bit of a maze, may not be visible to everybody, but the basic story there, if you compare over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2019 or so, you will see that there is some change in the structure of exports, less apparels and footwear, so light manufacturing, and towards more sophisticated products like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, nuclear reactors and parts, electrical machinery and parts. So that's the broad picture. On the import side, it's from UK to India, it's less metals and more instruments and more beverages. And beverages is something that many will remember, because that's a sticking point for India in negotiations. We'll come back to that point. Here's a very important chart, is on services, right? So this shows the bilateral trade balance in services. What we have done is we've aggregated 2016 to 2019, and this is all pre-COVID, because COVID obviously disturbs many things both. So even on the trade side, that's why we stopped at 2019, because it's skewed by medical instruments, medicines, and so on. So for 2016 to 2019 cumulatively, we find the UK's exports of services to India are leading. I mean, in terms of exports, it's greater than India's exports in the insurance and pension services sector, in financial services, and in IP, intellectual property, and also in telecom and computers. But on the flip side, India exports much more when it comes to professional services, business services, and there's a whole bucket of other services. This is a very important slide in terms of the argument that Dr. Srinivasan and I are making, so we'll keep coming back to this issue. So what is what's the context for India and the UK for these FTAs, right? So in the case of the UK, it's kind of it's pretty well known that there was the whole Brexit-induced rush, right? So it raised the trade costs for the UK and with the EU, and it was by far the EU's largest trading partner. And then they did sign an FTA with the EU in 2021, but it is compared to what the EU agreement is, this FTA is very shallow, right? So it is not really a patch on the earlier agreement. So UK has been in a frenzy of signing FTAs. Most of them are basically maintenance FTAs, that is mimicking what the EU already had with these respective countries. So they've signed 38 FTAs since its exit from the EU, but only 2 were sort of freshly minted FTAs. So it's negotiating a new FTA with the US, the Gulf cooperation countries, and with the CPTPP group, and with India, of course, it's hoping to sign this year. Maybe there's seems to be a Diwali, seems to be a favored deadline on both sides. What's happening in the UK is that this is a chart from the Peterson Institute, which basically shows, it's a bit involved and a bit dense, but the basic point here is that UK's trade and inward FDI has suffered, FDI and immigrant has declined significantly if you compare pre and post Brexit, and it's very pronounced if you compare it with the relative to the EU countries. So this explains why UK is now looking for new markets, or in a bit of a rush. What's the Indian context? And of course, many of you will be very familiar with this. India withdrew from RCEP after 7 years of negotiation in November 2019. And RCEP, of course, we all know, is the largest grouping in the world in terms of GDP. Compared with EU or USMCA. There is India's preference erosion as a result of this, and its desire to find other markets. And it seems that India's enthusiasm for bilateral free trade agreements has increased recently. Is it easier to control the pace of liberalization in the bilateral context versus a more plurilateral context? That's a question. I think so. India had 10 FTAs until 2020, but which includes treaties on trade and transit. So the hardcore FTAs were basically SAFTA, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. These are the hardcore FTAs, right? And also one other context is that India has increased the pace of FDI liberalization in the last couple of years, and therefore that has resulted in a surge in inward FDI in India. And this includes the insurance sector, which is of great interest to the UK. So another context in India is there is a significant protection increase for the last 6 to 8 years. If you look at average non-agricultural tariffs, they have gone up from roughly about 10% in 2014 to almost 15% in 2021. This is simple average, right? Non-weighted. And the tariff lines, and this is important for looking at dispersion, tariff lines in excess of 15%, right? Which increased from 8% in 2014 to 23.4% in 2021. So I think this is for trade wonks this is a significant indicator of, noise in the system and scope for discretionary measures. India has also historically been a very significant user of anti-dumping, and it continues in that tradition in 2021 as well. The other thing is that on services, services trade historically, this OECD, World Bank do a services trade restrictiveness index. Historically, India's services trade has been highly restricted when it comes to liberalizing, especially when it comes to allowing foreign investment and foreign players in. And historically, India, as I said, has always been, the restrictiveness has been high, and this hasn't changed all that much. If you look at in 2014, India was the most restricted out of 40 countries, and in 2021, it is 48 out of 50. So very little change in terms of restrictiveness. So now let's go to the impact, the next section of our presentation, which is the impact on trade and investment, right? And here we are essentially drawing on work done in the World Bank on comparing high depth and low depth integration, okay? And so when we go into deeper trade agreements, which is you basically cover areas which go beyond traditional agreements on just merely on tariffs and non-tariff measures. You get into services, you get into intellectual property or labor, environment, procurement, and so on and so forth. There are many chapters in these. And so when you get into these deeper trade agreements, there are different effects. And the calculation of the World Bank is that when you get into deeper trade agreements, there is the trade elasticity is roughly twice that when you have more shallow or lower depth trade agreements. So the impact on trade is 40% compared to more like 20% in the lower depth agreements. And the channels for these agreements are, that there are lowering of trade costs beyond the border. There are more knowledge spillovers, and therefore there is more potential to increase productivity. There is increasing returns because of greater market expansion. And there is also possible conversion of regulatory regimes, and therefore business environments become more predictable. Similarly, there is similar channels for investment, right? So deep integration also increases investment more than compared to more shallow agreements. And so, for example, if you add a discipline, again, World Bank Policy Research Working Paper, if you add a discipline to a free trade agreement or a preferential trade agreement, it increases FDI by 1.4% on average. So, and this especially affects manufacturing and services sectors. And disciplines that appear to matter more for investment, according to this research, are disciplines on investment. That means things like investment treaties, intellectual property rights, visa and asylum regulations, environment, labor market, and movement of capital and competition policy. These are the disciplines that seem to have a positive impact on investment. So the UK's own estimates of the incremental increase in the long-term potential trade impact of the FTA by 2035, right, compared to 2019. So if you have moderate liberalization in line with what we said earlier, if you have moderate liberalization, Indian exports would go up by about 7 billion, so 30% increase, and imports would go up by about 50%. Deeper liberalization, in line with what we said, would increase UK exports by almost 100%, and India's exports by about 64%. Now, you might ask why the significant differential? Well, it's the simple point is that India's tariffs are much higher, much more dispersed. So if you give preference to another country, right? So the preference effect is much larger, right? So the difference between the preferential tariff and the MFN tariff, the average tariff given to other countries, to non-trading partner countries, is much bigger, and therefore the preferential effect is larger. So let's get into a little bit now of the sectoral issues that are of interest to both India and the UK. And so let's start with where are India's gains expected to be, right? So again, mind you, as I said, in the absence of clear-cut information, this is based on our educated guesses. Now, but I think it seems could be accurate. So we looked at the graduated list for 21 and 22 in the UK, right? So UK runs a GSP scheme where it gives trade preferences to poorer countries, low and middle income, low income and lower middle income countries. So India was on that list, is on that list, but from time to time, many products are graduated because India, like other countries, becomes especially strong in those products. So for 21 and 22, these 2 calendar years, UK graduated a long list of products from India, no longer eligible for preferences, which including chemicals, importantly textiles and garments, pearls and precious metals, iron and steel, base metals, motor vehicles and parts and ships and aircraft, and railway and locomotives. Now, in all these sectors, after the agreement, where UK is expected to be pretty generous in terms of its trade offer, we can expect gains in all of these products, among others. But I think these will be some of the headline products where India is expected to gain. Now, what about on the other side, right, where UK and others would like greater market access, right? So I've taken up the case of the auto sector because something that I did a lot of work on in my younger days. My PhD thesis included. So I will say something about the automobiles sector in particular. But the automobile, spirits and dairy products have been sticklers for India in negotiations. They have come up repeatedly in UAE, Australia, and in general, there is noise around them. So, but it is sometimes hard to understand India's concerns. And so let's talk about automobiles, as I said. India is a global hub for small cars. The prices are half that for small cars, half that in the most competitive markets in the world, such as the US. So on-road prices in India, for example, just did a quick survey yesterday. On-road prices in India are $6,000 to $10,000 for competitive, high-quality small cars, versus at least $15,000 for in the US. And this is, mind you, when the taxes are 28% in India, GST, compared to 4.5% to 5% in the. So not even accounting for that, right? So if you do that, the differential will be even higher. And it's similar for two-wheelers of smaller engine capacity, right? So small, especially the smaller vehicles, smaller two-wheelers, India is a global leader, and we'll see some data on that too. So duties on the most expensive cars are 100%, and those which are less than $40,000 are 60%, and two-wheelers is 50%. So economists say that is there much water in the tariff in these products? So in a sense, domestic prices, if they fully reflected these high tariffs, would be 2 to 3 times the current domestic prices, right? So there is a lot of unnecessary, also what we call water in the tariff, because the domestic market in India is fiercely competitive, right? And we know this because many large companies, global companies, have tried their hand and exited India, including Ford Motors, many truck companies, but also car companies, Piaggio, and so on and so forth. So it's not an easy market to crack, and and consumers are getting what they want. Fuel efficient, small cars, relatively good quality, right? And so it's a fierce market. And we also have the full value chain in India. Auto component exports have been growing, from $14 billion in FY 2018 to, over $19 billion in the last fiscal year in 2022. So here the one question mark which TG and I discussed is the electric vehicles. Now, we know that several companies in India are making a thrust in that, but this is really the industry of the future. And is India ready here in the technology side, supply chains, domestic infrastructure? This is maybe a potential area for India-UK collaboration in terms of design and technology sharing. Right? So just to buttress the argument that I was just talking about, let's look at automobile sector exports from India, right? I mean, this is by any standards globally an extremely successful sector, right? Whether you look at passenger vehicles, which are mostly of the smaller variety, but the exports have seen a dip because of COVID, but overall the numbers are very healthy. If you look at the grand total, right? So especially on the two-wheeler sides where the sales seems to have almost doubled, right? So from 2.3 million to 4.4 million vehicles, right? So there is an overall very strong picture of exports, not a sector that you might call weak or that is using 100% and 60% kind of rates of duty. The other area where India talks about a lot is labor exports, so-called mode for migration, and this in every negotiation this comes up. So again, according to our spade work on the UK, it seems to have a pretty open and transparent regime for labor. For example, the skilled labor import policy requires no local market test for at least 349 shortage occupations, if the minimum salary is at least £25,600. Students, according to the British High Commission presentation a few days ago, they are allowed to work now for 2 years after their degrees. There's a very large increase in student flows from India to the UK, about 148% over the last year. And as well as in work visas, India seems to be, got overall about 500,000 visas in 2021, including student visas. Of course, like any other country, UK will give preference to its own workers, right? Every country, and that's legitimate, every country in the world does that. So we're struggling to understand are there any additional gains from deep negotiations in this area, except at the margin in terms of details. For example, business folks that we've talked to spoke of multiple entry long-term visas to develop business or to go for regular meetings, right? So without having to keep going for visa applications, or increasing student work period to 3 years and so on, like others, maybe I think the US has done, and other partners may have done. So, but these are, you will agree that these are incremental and marginal in terms of the larger picture. So the other area that's very important is investment, right? And this, I think here we don't really have clear-cut answers. We're kind of raising questions, right? So post-Brexit, what are the incentives for mutual investment? Remember that India is the second largest investor in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is about the 5th or 6th largest investor in India. So there are stakes on both sides, big stakes on both sides. So what are the incentives post-Brexit? With now there is no longer a seamless European platform from investing in the UK versus the incentives from an FTA, right? So these are the sort of two opposing incentives that appear to be in play. For UK firms to invest in India, yes, there is the positive impact of a free trade agreement, but as we said earlier, a deeper agreement will yield more investment, and it seems, at least currently, the UK's firms' incentives depend on the overall investment climate that affect both domestic and foreign firms. And the question, I think, for India would be to how to attract greenfield UK investment in collaboration in high-tech areas where the UK is a global leader. For example, in research and development, in the pharma sector, in healthcare, great skills on both sides, renewable energy and battery technology, electric vehicles, digital technologies, and so on. So these are some of the issues that would come up when it comes to incentives for mutual investment post FTA. So let's now talk about, this is more like a thought process, a long-term approach. What could a long-term approach to trade liberalization be? We're not saying that this is what's going to happen in the current context, but this might be one approach that will yield long-term dividends, right? So services sector, I promise that we will come back to this several times. Services sector is fundamental to overall exports and economic efficiency. We've all heard the story of servicification, right? So now over 1/3 of global manufacturing exports, the value added from that originates in the services sector, right? So even though they are manufacturing exports in terms of final goods, but the composition of that is at least 1/3 services. So a vibrant services sector is very important, not just for services in their own right, and the services dominate the Indian economy now, but they also have a massive spillover effect for the overall economy and especially for exports, including manufacturing exports. So easing restrictions on services, which we spoke about, can accelerate productivity improvements, drawing on the UK's strengths in many areas. And again, a study quoted in the World Development Report on Value Chains of 2020 showed that a 1 standard deviation increase in the aggregate index of services liberalization resulted in a productivity increase of almost 12% for domestic firms and 13% for foreign firms. And here's the OECD STRI services index broken down by sectors for 2021. And you can see that some of the least restricted versus some of the most restricted services in India. Least restricted include engineering, computer services, sound recording, and road freight. And some of the most restricted, insurance, accounting, architecture, and rail freight. And some of these, the UK is very strong. So there is potential for collaboration here. So a long-term approach to trade liberalization, what would it look like, right? So one is that a tariff-based approach is preferable to quotas or a tariff rate quotas because they are more transparent in impact. So even if you have high tariffs and you reduce them gradually, that would be preferable than using a sort of partial quota-based regime. When tariffs yield revenues to the Indian government versus quotas yielding no revenue, the monitoring burden for quotas is much higher, and quota rents can often go to foreign firms and exporters. A tariff-based approach should include commitments over a longer-term period, well-defined. And yes, certain sectors can be excluded. Every country does that on grounds of sensitivity, for example, certain agricultural products. But exclusions should be limited in terms of percentage of tariff lines, right? So the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement has limited barely 2% or 3% of overall tariff lines, for example. India is a growing global trade power, right? We know we know very well that India's now global exports are last year were in excess of $650 billion. So India as a growing trade power cannot expect continued asymmetric treatment as it has been getting and indeed expects to get in the UK FTA as well. But for how much longer, right? It is really a significant, now not just an economic power, but now a growing trade power. And the basic philosophy in trade, like in any economics, is some will gain, some will need to restructure. There is no free lunch, right, in any policy decision. Continuing in this vein, sometimes, we have what we call a mercantilist approach to free trade agreements, right? So when you just tot up the gains and losses in exports and imports, right? So how much will my exports go up and how much will my imports go up? Well, in the existing free trade agreements, and it's appropriate that we sit in NITI Aayog today because a NITI Aayog study done by Saraswat, Priya and Ghosh in 2017 or 2018 showed that in the existing FTAs, preference utilization has been less than 25%. And export growth in FTA countries was on par with export growth in non-FTA countries. Right? So this should make us think about why this has happened. So the real gains from trade go well beyond mercantilist calculations, right? They go of exports and imports. They come from medium to long-term gains in productivity, which are at the heart of trade liberalization. And certainly services and other disciplines commitments are those which lead to true benefits of trade liberalization. A word on India's neighbors, right? We don't, and this is not really part of India's calculus, but TG and I work a lot on South Asia, and so we felt obligated to include something on that because this is at the point it is important for India overall as in terms of its own strategic and economic calculus. So there will be as a result of this FTA, there will be certainly preference erosion for South Asian neighbors. There is impending graduation of Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan in the next 3 years from LDC status, right? And India's improved market access will divert trade from some trade from these countries as well as from Sri Lanka and Pakistan, especially in apparels and textiles where these countries are strong. So what could South Asian countries do? Well, first of all, they could have more mutual foreign investment, mutual value chains where they can capitalize on some of the trade impact of the UK-India FTA, ride on that. Investing in each other, creating regional value chains, and also they could negotiate because UK has shown that it is in the mood for early harvest deals. They could try to negotiate some limited trade agreements with the UK in their own right, especially those who are with impending graduation. So final thoughts to leave you with. So we'll start with on the challenges side, right? So the benefits are asymmetric of the proposed UK-India FTA. In terms of liberalization, UK is liberalizing more. I'm sure that will be the case. But also UK needs India a lot more than reverse. But certainly India has also urgent reasons to want such an agreement. And that's the political kind of push on both sides for different reasons. They seem to both want an early harvest deal, both countries. But this may yield, for reasons that I've gone into in the previous half an hour or so, this may yield lower benefits and delay deeper integration because India's history shows that once it signs a free trade agreement, it doesn't really go back to the drawing board and come back for deeper commitments. So if it signs, if the countries sign an early harvest, this could be a major dampener on long-term benefits given India's history. We also saw that there was a lot of public and parliamentary consultation in the UK on this, and in India it was limited. It has been limited to select industry. But the UK consultation has been much wider. So they say maybe more public acceptance of what transpires. And of course, signing of the FTA does not guarantee preference utilization, as the NITI study pointed out. Also in the UK consultation, what came out was that UK stakeholders are somewhat apprehensive of Indian policy uncertainty, bureaucracy, and different layers of government. This is what the consultations were saying. And Another issue is that UK has a commitment to net zero goals, and this will be demanding on Indian exporters, but this will also present an opportunity on collaboration, on investment, and getting sort of pulling each other up by the bootstraps. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity. And finally, what are the sort of on the opportunity side, some final thoughts from the UK-India FTA. So there is a lot of complementarity, both in the goods, but especially in the services sector, which, as we mentioned, this is something, this is for the future in terms of overall economic efficiency and productivity impact. This will be very important for India. This, for India, it reverses in part, especially preference erosion vis-a-vis Vietnam. Vietnam has signed the RCEP, UK-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement as well. So Vietnam has been at the forefront of many actually deeper trade agreements. So partial liberalization, reversal of that preference erosion for India. As we said, UK's innovation lead, global leader, number 4 in the world, it can diffuse more to India with the FTA and raise productivity growth. And this is part of the dynamic gains from trade, which go well beyond the kind of static estimates that we presented, the UK's estimates, which are still very static. So the dynamic gains, productivity gains for the Indian economy, especially if we start thinking in terms of services sector liberalization, including more disciplines in the FTA, then these dynamic gains would transpire. And some of these would include, for example, the regulatory framework of the UK, which can provide templates for India's behind the border reforms. And of course, there is no doubt that the historic linguistic ties, the diaspora, very vibrant diaspora between the two countries, that can help. And this is the first proposed FTA with a Western country, not a developed country, because India does have with Japan and Korea, but one can argue that this is the first with one where cultural and historical ties are much deeper, first with a Western country of that nature. So potential for a diffusion is high, provided some of these issues that TG and I have raised are taken on board. So thank you for your time and patience listening. Look forward to feedback.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kathuria, for the wonderful presentation. I have some questions, but I'll come to that later. I would give the floor to Dr. Harshvardhan Singh for the...
Why don't you ask your questions, then I can something in mind. Or you might cover my...
Okay. So, more than some are questions, some are responses. So, coming to starting from the STRI, I agree that India's services trade restrictiveness is high compared to other countries, but also the definitional, the methodology and definitional issues in STRI that make India's own STRI the actual restrictiveness and what is captured in STRI. I think there could be some discrepancy, and I think Rajat is actually doing some study on that, so to develop our own methods. So that's more of a minor point, but it still is true that India's restrictiveness is going to be higher, even with the new measure. And the point you mentioned about the trade remedies, one thing that we have to notice in the recent years, particularly after 2021, there have been no new trade remedies, so which is a positive development. The older remedies, many of them exist still, but new remedies have come down because now we are looking at the the cascading impact of trade remedies, not only that particular sector, but how does it affect the other sectors. So that is one aspect. And um, another thing is about when it comes to the negotiations on services trade, lot of it is centered around the digital aspects of services trade. And for example, we have right now a lot of Indian companies can telecast their services in the UK, so to say. This audio visual services are in that sense open already. But what we are trying to negotiate, I think, is to keep that access permanent. Have the countries commit to some of the things that are already happening, some of the digital transactions that are already happening without any impediment. So it's more of a commitment of free flow of services trade. That I think that is a major aspect. Similarly, when it comes to things like legal services, again, outsourcing is a part of that. So these are all happening already, but we want to just firm that up, that this commitment is going to stay. And another aspect is, I think you rightly highlighted the sectors. So basically, as I said, mostly these are comments, not much questions. The sectors you highlighted, auto industry and also whiskey. So these are some sectors that are sensitive from our side. But like you also said, if you go to the granular level, if you go which sectors or where do we have high tariffs and where do we have high competitiveness, there actually we can make a lot of progress in terms of where we can reduce tariffs. And in terms of the utilization, it is true that that study by our honorable member Dr. Saraswat points out that utilization is low, so the direct impact of FTAs are relatively low. But there are a couple of things that we found over time in interacting with the Commerce Department. One is, even if you look at some of the past FTAs, they were actually not FTAs in the truest sense. They were PTAs basically. They were only specific sectors which are opened up. And if we really look at the granular data on those sectors, there have been some gains. And utilization also in the recent years, after that study, in the recent years have increased. So DGFT is going to release data on that, and it seems they have looked at much more granular level of data there, actual transactions data, and the good news is utilization is increasing.
Like how
So around more than 50%, 60-70% is what I heard. So that is one. And these are all just like follow up some kind of positive developments that have been happening. And apart from this, I completely agree with you on the potential that exists beyond the short-term gains, the dynamic aspects. And there I would also like to add a couple of things there. One is the investor sentiment. So once the trade deal is signed, apart from the nuances, apart from the details, it also gives a fillip to the investment. People, the British investors, they are going to be more positive about investing here and vice versa. And another thing is, in the past we have seen that many times we have missed the bus in terms of attracting investments for market access. So a lot of countries would like to invest in a country that has market access to the UK. So that is another aspect. So other countries that do not have an FTA with the UK, instead of negotiating a painstaking FTA, they can actually come and invest in India, provided we also improve our investment climate. That is a different question. At least this is one thing. Another thing that we have been talking about is also the positive effects of trade diversion. So even if we import more from UK, if that import displaces some of the imports from our kind of tricky countries, then I wouldn't name anyone, but then that's a positive, and that's a thought process that is there. And I think one tricky thing in the negotiations with both UK and EU is the the labor and environmental standards, and they are very much on the table, because without that they won't negotiate. So one thought that I personally am not talking as a government functionary, but one thought I have as a trade analyst is that when we negotiate these free trade agreements, we are looking for something more than MFN plus. So in that context, when we have these standards, and particularly if these standards are going to lead to some costs and they act as non-tariff barriers, then is it worthwhile for us to go ahead and do this? Because in the countries which do not have FTAs, they get probably slightly less market access, but at a low cost, because they don't have those standards to be followed. So that's the only, probably that's the question, but others are more like kind of supporting your presentation. Thank you. Over to you. Maybe you would like. So I like request Dr. Harshvardhan Singh to give his discussion comments.
Thank you. I wanted you to speak because I was thinking you covered some of my points, and you did. So thank you for that. A very, very comprehensive presentation, thought process. Few points, and I'm not thinking only as an economist, I'm thinking as a negotiator also, because this is a negotiation. And the India-UK FTA today cannot be seen only as a bilateral FTA. It has implications for India-EU FTA, for example. So if India gives something on automobiles in the UK, it becomes a stronger reason for EU to demand similar kind of things, which may not be a problem, but what I'm saying is there are linkages. Second, costs and benefits, the studies which have looked at costs and benefits, they don't necessarily see the political sensitivity of certain sectors. You know, RCEP, India got out of for 5 different reasons, and one of them was dairy. So even if you look at the FTA with Australia, etc., and it was concerned with Australia in that context, otherwise 2 other concerns were basically they related to China. So once you take political costs into account and you recognize that there are benefits involved, you must then think of how to manage the transition to a better situation while managing your problems which you are facing. So that's where, as a negotiator, you start thinking of flexibilities. You start thinking, so flexibility is not only transition, there are multiple ways of looking at flexibilities. And it could also involve a review, it could involve assistance, etc. It's very interesting that many times you use the word collaboration. And it's very important that when you look at an FTA today, one must think of it not only as opening up the market, because you start by trade liberalization, but also as an instrument which can build further collaborative initiatives, something you have emphasized many times, and I think that needs to be done. On UK's liberalizing more, you know, it all depends on how you define liberalization. Today, UK tariff has 52.5% of its tariff lines with 0 tariffs in total. And if I look at non-agriculture, it is 54.6. So it's like half of Singapore, in the sense Singapore has 100. So UK might feel, and then if you really take a look at up to 5 and up to 10, it's basically it covers 92% of tariff lines. And for India, it covers just about 60%, 61%.
So what is it, when you said?
Sorry?
What does it mean? What
the 0 to 10.
0 to 10, okay.
So 0 to 5 covers 71% of UK's tariff lines, just 5. And then another 5 to 10 covers about 19%. So if you take a look at 0 to 10 as sectors where you have larger flexibility politically or in terms of whatever objective you are thinking of, how to then see the opening up, actually the burden of liberalization is far larger on India,
Yes.
if you really think about it. So by one criteria, UK might be liberalizing more, but by another criteria, India might be liberalizing more. And in a negotiation, you have to look at both these things. And how to manage it becomes very significant. And I think what UK will ask India for will be not an easy thing, but India is today with an approach that it wants to continue to connect with more and more markets. And in terms of exports, UK is not really a major market, but it's not a small market also. So the interesting thing is that it's a pathway to other markets, and UK is very keen. So it's a good FTA to get into, but how to manage the other costs becomes important. The other thing is, I think it's important that you mention at least two very significant aspects. One is global value chain. You mentioned in a few times, but if we are thinking of an FTA, we must adopt a global value chain approach. When you are discussing with industry, and India does discuss a lot with industry on their sensitivities, etc. Each industry will say for its own sector what to do. But if you have a GVC approach and you combine the different asks, so to say, or desires, you can see the knock-on effects and what it means for investment, for trade linkages, your competitiveness, etc. So, in my thinking, if in an FTA as a negotiator, you do not shift to a thinking along the lines of a GVC framework, in some sense, you are not adequately looking at the kind of opportunities which are there. And in that context, UK is a small stepping stone. UK is not a large stepping stone. But your framework, if you adopt that way in your negotiating framework, then it's a framework to be applied to larger and larger interactions. The second thing is digital. You know, people keep thinking about environment and labor, etc. In my view, India can manage environment and labor. But there are aspects of digital where the differences are very large. And that's one area where some agreement will need to come. And digital, as Badri said, digital is both a platform and how that platform is evolving the manner in which you do trade. So that's something which needs to be looked at, and how to enable that. And that's where I think some of the flexibilities, etc., become important. On regulatory framework of UK serving as a model for world, I hesitate with that. You know, the TTIP negotiation between US and and EU, and that time UK was within the EU, focused on regulatory coherence. It was, tariffs were not a problem. It was regulatory coherence, and it failed. One of the things was also government procurement related issue, but it became very difficult to even reach an agreement between US and EU on various sectors of interest, including automobiles. So, if we have to expand our exports in the world, we have to take into account MRA kind of an approach, not have the same regulatory conditions, because we may be able to sell it in the EU market but not in the US market. And today our exports are far larger in the US market than they are in the UK market. Let me just put it that way. EU, of course, our exports are high. So the other thing is, a lot of, and this is an economist way of talking about FTAs, that is liberalization. So, in one sense, that's correct. In another sense, because the term liberalization has a sensitivity to the domestic industry, perhaps one has to try and think about it in terms of at the border, behind the border. And if you really look at behind the border trade reform, so it's more reform rather than liberalization per se. Good regulatory principles. They are not liberalization, but they facilitate, and therefore they ease. You can say because they ease, it's liberalization. But the point I'm making is that the kind of, and you have emphasized this behind the border. It's not as if you have not emphasized it. But India is actually conducting a lot of behind the border reforms. And in the areas where you like automobile, etc., you pointed out that, look, India is very competitive. Actually, with these reforms in 2, 3, 4 years, India will be far more competitive in many sectors, not just in this sector. So, to the extent the Indian negotiator has to take own policy into account or approach into account, that's a very important aspect to keep in mind to reduce one's nervousness. The behind the border reform is being conducted also with great focus because domestic industry actually benefits. So it's a reform which will help both the domestic industry and others who are operating in the domestic territory. Combine that with trade facilitation reform. So that's where imports and exports also become easier to implement. I think given this emphasis on behind the border reform, addressing trade concerns through good regulatory principles becomes very, very significant. And that's a very important part of trade agreements. Which brings me to the issue of tariffs versus non-tariff measures. Again, you've talked about standards, etc. But the problem is that an FTA actually gives an easier solution to tariff-related issues than to a non-tariff related issue. How do you address that? And that's where collaboration aspect comes in. And I'll explain what I have in mind, because one must use the FTA not only in the context of FTA, but as a platform to build upon it. And that's why I like very much the use of your term collaboration. If you take a look at the APEC group of countries, they have a process under which some of the member countries who have dealt with certain LTMs actually share their best practices and help other countries to increase their own operational efficiency. I think such a regulatory dialogue should become part of every FTA. And that is something which will address the non-tariff measures. Otherwise, the concern which India had about FTAs with ASEAN, Japan, etc. If you take a look at the tariffs are low, and Indian tariffs decrease from very high levels. But the non-tariff measures of these countries are very high. So if the FTAs do not show benefits, support for the FTAs becomes limited, and any estimation of benefits is not going to address that concern. That's on the ground. The interesting thing is, actually, on trade diversion or addressing Vietnam, it's a very temporary phenomenon because UK has applied for CPTPP. UK actually has an FTA with, but to the extent we feel that our trade preference erosion will be addressed, then the trade preference should be at least the level of TPPP. And that is not going to be any agreement in the future because TPPP has more than 90% and in many cases up to 100% tariff liberalization. So yes, it will be partially addressed, but while our FTA is going to take place, the world goes on with many other FTAs. Again, I want to emphasize on trade restrictive index of services. I have not looked at data behind it, but I remember I was discussing this within the Delhi World Bank office, and I saw in telecom, I've been a telecom regulator, and I didn't think that the index was correctly reporting the extent of liberalization in telecom. So if it is true for telecom, it might be true for many other sectors. But what is correct is that services liberalization does lead to a multiplier effect which is way larger than goods liberalization. When we were doing liberalization in telecom, the assessment was that the multiplier factor is 7, which is a very large number. On anti-dumping, I didn't understand your point. Just because India is using anti-dumping and large number as a large user, what is the point which you are making? Is it that anti-dumping should not be encouraged or should not be used because it's a legitimate tool? Or is it that more scrutiny is required of anti-dumping, but an FTA will not be able to do that? What can be done within an FTA? I think on anti-dumping, subsidies, countervails, safeguards, FTAs, if anything, will only add to the possibility of safeguards or anti-dumping rather than decrease whatever is in WTO. As far as this, when you discuss deeper FTAs, now deeper is both the subject matters, and they are evolving. I mean, different FTAs are adding subject matters. as well as the depth of the obligations. And there is a third factor, which is the solutions to your trade policy concerns or trade access concerns. I'm very I admire the kind of thing which was negotiated in TPP and now CPTPP. It's in market access chapter 2.9.2. You have a mechanism that if a country has problems in its exports, access to the other market, the other member will sit down and work out with the agreed member a solution to that. I think that's the only way to address NTMs. Otherwise, you are not going to solve the problem. And I don't see that in RCEP. RCEP is a light agreement. It doesn't have certain sectors. It doesn't have dispute settlement in some of the sectors which are there. So RCEP is light. But if you want to really look for solutions, I think that's something, and also for flexibilities, both WTO and CPTPP, the EU, Canada, etc. These are good models. EU, Japan, because state enterprise reform is again an area which is of major focus, and it's a sensitive area for India. How to manage that, and that is what will enable India to get the agreement through. I think on auto components, India might find willing acceptance of the industry for the FTA, because from my understanding, they feel comfortable and confident. Automobiles, the problem is, and this is an approach problem, the automobile sector relies dominantly on the domestic sector. Exports are residual. The global market, although there are objectives that will achieve this much exports, etc., in this year, etc. So, in some sense, together with FTA, a reform process has to be evolved, which enables the kind of shift from one way of looking at the global markets to another way of looking at global markets. So, because you can have FTAs, but you don't have the reform at home, that FTA is going to be just a burden on you, because the benefits come with your reform. And one of these big reforms have to be, that's what the transition period gives you access to, namely enabling reform. So, but that's a domestic policy issue. So FTA and the issues cannot be seen just on its own. And you pointed out some of the ways in which FTAs, you said that India has not gone ahead again to FTAs to deepen it, etc. But one of the shortcomings in my view is that the concomitant domestic reform was not done. So together with the FTA, an agenda for reform, and today India is very, very serious in a number of areas for reform. I completely see what you're saying about e-vehicles, etc., in terms of collaboration. But an FTA doesn't improve in a large way, especially with just one nation, the possibilities of collaboration. And so one has to see where are the larger possibilities. And another way of collaborating is not to just by investment in UK or investment in India, but joint ventures which access rest of the markets. can you, in some sense, create, because all global value chains are essentially regional value chains. And since India is negotiating with the EU as well, can you think in terms of partnerships which look at third markets? So that's again a reform agenda. It's not an FTA agenda. But since you talked about partnership, this is another way of looking at it. On ensuring, and Badri, you said that we are hoping that the digital access we have at present, that is maintained. Actually, every FTA, when you actually commit your services sector, that commitment is less than your actual situation. There's no FTA which has extended the actual situation. So if we are able to do that, the other side will ask us also for those things. So we have to see how to manage that and where is a large benefit for India, which you can, so that's where the benefit cost analysis can help very much. Some key sectors where we are looking for possibilities which are going to come in the future. They are the dynamic sectors. And we could include the PLI sectors in that. I mean, you have aspirations for those sectors. So, on mode 4 migration, you use the word migration. My suggestion is not to mix these two. The migration is something else, and that's what scares countries when you talk about mode 4. And long-term visas are often not granted because your period of stay can entitle you to seek, immigration. So one has to look at it that way, but I think UK will be far more open on business travel. In fact, UK's Prime Minister May, when she had come here, she had offered that sector as one of the sectors she would be willing to give. But if Mode 4 is going to be sorted out to some extent with EU, we can expect something better in UK also. So I think Mode 4 is an area where we might actually do better than what we have done in most other places. But what we have to understand is Mode 4 on its own, Mode 4 it's like an entry permit. So it's not a visa which allows you to come in. I'm distinguishing between a possibility. So it is necessary to improve your access, but it's not sufficient. That's where the standards of what the other country actually requires you to operate, to work in that country. And it's in that context, I think we must think of Mode 3 and Mode 1 together, which is cross-border. And that links up with the digital thing which you were talking about. We have to look in a strategic sense, combining Mode 1 and Mode 3. And that might actually enable us much larger access than otherwise. On your point that India cannot expect asymmetric treatment, I think this is a political point. And whatever anybody says, till India is a low middle income country, its expectations for asymmetry, if it can expect GST, then there's no reason that it will not expect an asymmetric treatment. The issue is how asymmetric and how to engage in such a way that you become more and more part of the new system. And India has started moving in that direction, but it's not there yet. Not by Diwali, not by next Diwali, not by next Diwali after that. So, to me, saying that India should not expect asymmetry, and you are talking to the Indians, if you tell the UK, they'll be happy, but then it's the Indians who have to say, okay, we don't. That's something which I don't think is going to work. So that's aspirational, but India will continue to look at agreements where a developed country gives more, and a developed country is in a position to give more. So, but I again come back to the use of your word collaboration. We have to stop looking at FTAs as 0-1 kind of, that either it has to be converted into a win-win. And it's the behind the borders, investment, etc. sectors, which will convert it into a win-win. And in many cases, the kind of reforms which India is doing, they mesh very well with what the FTAs require. So we must start looking at FTAs not only as a tariff kind of thing where I have to open my tariffs, in my market by reducing my tariffs, which yes, it is true. But that's where the flexibility is coming. But as something which actually is not confrontational, it is collaborational. And that to me is the way a country like India has to look at FTAs, together with GVCs, together with opportunities where you improve the larger kind of efficiencies which you talk about. Maybe a good idea to enumerate some of them, or if you have evidence of that, to give that evidence. For the moment, these are the points I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Maybe would you like to respond, or can we ask some more questions from the audience?
You want to say something?
But just before that, I would like to invite all of you to start having lunch, with due apologies to the people online who are deprived of this delicious lunch.
Does that mic work? Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much, both of you so far, Badri and
More closely.
So,
Yeah.
Actually, your insights as a practitioner sitting here and your insights as a negotiator are both valuable for us. I think you emphasize the costs of liberalization are higher for India because there are political. I think one way economies deal with the cost of liberalization is not just looking at the trade per se. The trade effects is what we have shown, like how much trade will improve. Mercantilism, what the economist approach is to look at the overall welfare impact, which take into account the costs also of liberalization. Again, if you look at that also, the welfare benefits are definitely there for India. And it's more. And also, I'd like to emphasize again the model-based calculus. Here's a GTAP expert sitting here. They always produce pretty small numbers. You may not even bother to negotiate if something is 0.1%, 0.2% of a GDP. But it's only the dynamic gains, the collaborations, the diffusion of knowledge, and the productivity gains, which are not shown in the models. That will really help India. And the trade economists are actually doing a catch-up with what has actually happened in the world. They are trying to model the surge in growth of countries which open that. So, even if you, as an economist, you can always do some partial patch-up work to reflect the productivity by sector. But the truth remains that with a country which is far more advanced than us in regulations and in technology, we have a lot to gain by going for a deeper negotiation. There are many interesting points you made. It's difficult for me to elaborate on them. I welcome all the points that you made, and in a future version, we would definitely build on what you have suggested. Badri, I think you were in points on the utilization are also valid. I'm really hard pressed. If you look at UK-India FTA agreement, you find far richer stuff on the UK side than anything on India. Sitting outside India, for us it's much harder to find the scale of academic work and the consultations. It seems to be higher on the UK side for me to find it much easier than to look at the Indian points of view. These meetings are a big help in that regard. And these are the general points I have. We can go into any details.
I don't disagree with you that welfare effects are large, etc. But in a political context,
Give
you're basically talking about
after this will.
the general. It's a expansion versus distribution issue. But the sector which is shrinking or is scared and is politically
I think after,
then irrespective of what gains you actually have, you have to deal with that problem. So the point I was making was that since you have to deal with it, you have to also think of flexibilities. And you have not mentioned it in your paper at all. If you don't have that as part of your assessment of an FTA, you will not have the FTA. In TPP, the US had a very strong safeguard. They called it snapback safeguard. In the auto sector with Japan, they basically said, we have certain expectations of market access. If those market access expectations are not realized, we will go into dispute, and it will result in us taking away all that we are providing you. Snapback, that's what they meant. So that was the poison pill, so to say, to Japan to open, keep it maintained, open up, etc. But that was necessary for them both to open up the market and assuage their constituencies at home. Similarly, in automobiles, in TPP, US for certain products took a 30-year transition period. No country in the world had taken that. They needed it in order to sign the TPP. That's the point I'm making. You cannot have an FTA if you just talk about overall benefits are very large, etc. No, there are pain points which you have to address, and those need a specific way of addressing them. And you have to be creative about it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I think Dr. Chadha has a couple of questions. Let's go.
Yeah, if it's on.
We can take this one.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was very informative and educative, and excuse me for my I have been a bit out of this particular FTA, even though I was involved in the earlier FTAs, Singapore, Japan, China, in fact with China also. One of the major studies that we had done, which was the second study, Joint Task Force. My first query, or trying to understand, is that has there been a similar kind of an effort of modeling the benefits at all, or we are not yet there? So I don't know whether, every time we used to start with a particular FTA, there used to be a modeling study, generally general equilibrium analysis. So just for my curiosity, since I am a bit out of it now, has there been a similar study on the Indo-UK, and maybe it is not yet out? My second query is, in general, as was explained by you, the protectionism has gone up during the last 8 years. So even if we are reducing it to some extent, we are probably reaching the earlier stage. I'm not sure, I have not computed. So uh, has this increase in protectionism harmed the trade and growth in any way? Is yet another query that I have. I am out of the trade studies for the last couple of years, so I won't be able. But I would very much wish to know the the tariff increases that you showed. Uh, have they affected the growth and welfare of the economy? My third observation, the last observation, is that uh, everybody is celebrating Diwali, but I have a report from the UK India Free Trade Agreement. This is the House of Lords trade, report as recent as July, where they are highly disappointed with the way India takes its FTAs forward, and they are questioning the government to do a deeper study into it. So I'm not. Since I came across it, I was a bit wonderstruck that is Diwali really Diwali, or are they still uh, in a mode where they would make it late rather than us? Just two or three queries. I just wanted to put it on.
More questions online.
Maybe I think we can get some more questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Seda, for the wonderful questions. Anybody online? Somebody has raised hands.
Maybe Karan can those who raise their hands.
You can unmute themselves.
So you can unmute and ask your question. Whoever has.
Yes. Yes. Am I heard? Hello?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I be
Anjali.
heard?
Yeah, please.
Um,
Yeah, we can hear you, Anjali. Please go ahead.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. As a courtesy, I must thank the organizers, the presenters, and the discussants for a wonderful event. Uh, I'll come straight to my query. So, for if we go ahead with the FTA, and we know that LDCs such as Bangladesh, who are ahead of us in industries such as textiles, would have a zero tariff, already have a zero tariff access to the UK market. So there is a possibility that we might land up, a lot of trade diversion might still happen, and we might land up receiving a lot of Bangladeshi textiles in our own territory if we have a seamless arrangement with UK. So I wanted the views of Professor Kathuria and uh, maybe Professor Harshvardhan also on these concerns.
Thank you, Anjali. Anybody else want to ask questions online?
Yeah, may I, Arpita?
Yeah, please go ahead, Arpita. Yeah.
Okay,
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
so basically, I don't know why my hands have stopped working today. So basically, a couple of things, Sanjay, for your work. Both sides for the deal has already identified around 30 sectors for the negotiations with sectors and subsectors. Among them, agro processing on both sides have been a key sector. I'm just giving you the gaps, and I can share with you the reports on the sectors. So there are sector reports, and probably you will have many more sectors to come in. We actually have a positive trade balance with the UK in agriculture and agro processing. So that's a major sector for us. It is also a major sector for them. And therefore we need to look into the agreement in that light. Secondly, countervailing duty is not like we actually face. We are second in line after the China in countervailing duty if you go by the WTO list. Whereas if you look at the trade, we are much behind China. This is majorly because of many of our subsidy regimes which are now getting changed. Third is on many of these many things UK has done, like multiple entry 10-year visa you have. The problem is about the visa fee. I don't think that is going to change, but what you can do is under a trade agreement, you can bind the existing regime. UK has something more innovative than us, like a startup visa, which we don't have. So, in context of the visa negotiation, somewhere we may have to broaden our regulatory regime to have something like a startup visa if we are talking to the European Union and the UK, which present Indian regime does not offer, and they offer. Now, when you come to the issue of investment, the core, they have three core issues. One core issue is that the bilateral investment agreements are no longer there in India, and India has, by taking them off, India has shown that it can be erratic. So they would not only like, but there is, all the trading partners would like to have a bilateral investment agreement in place. I see SDS India's membership in place. So it's quite, through RCEP also now even China has, agreed to such stuff. So there is a big issue there. And what we found in the entire process of the trade negotiations, because also to give Rajesh through support Rajesh, the CGE modeling study has been done in the UK. You can see it in the DIT website. They have done a very, very detailed study, but we can do a counterpart Indian study, but they have uploaded it in the website. The core issue here is that, when you sit for a negotiation, there are subject matters where they would like something to have, we would like something to have. Now, if you give them something they want to have, for example, you gave them in apples in tariff reduction, which is good, but you came back and said no GMO certification is required, which is, they are actually, they don't have a GMO, so they don't have an agency to certify. So, if you, in the middle of a trade deal, if we come out with these funny regulations, like we want to export organic, but we have put an import ban on organic, but so, the UK company, which is trying to establish a presence in India, is not able to actually source organic tea from India and make an organic tea in India, simply because we have banned imports of, organic of any product, be it Thai lemon zest. I'm just giving you an example. So there are many problems at ground which needs to be thought into. And in case of alcoholic beverages, maybe we don't want to allow the imports be below a threshold, but what about the intermediate products? Because for whiskey, whatever intermediate products that we import for make in India is from the UK. This is 70% of their agri export. Like, you can't expect them to do a deal without that. So there are products which are very, very sensitive on both sides. But I think, because we are a high tariff country, it always shows that we have to reduce tariff and our gains are less, but cumulative gains are much more, but it will depend not only on the tariff, it will also depend on the rules of origin. If we put a very, very rigid rules of origin, we are not able to meet the export requirement. And when we were talking to the textile, automobile and auto component industries, what we found is, within the textile, the domestic producers want a 40% tariff, the Indian exporters, they want a 18% tariff. So they will themselves not be able to match the value addition norms if we put a very, very higher norm. So this is one problem we found when we were doing the consultation. The other problem that we found when we did the consultation was, in the case of automobile, the story is very simple. Let's not complicate the story. The story is, with the UK, with CM, with Tata as a head, wants liberalization. So CM, which is a roadblock everywhere in the world, wants a liberalization with the UK. Maruti is a roadblock. And when we asked Maruti, they gave a very simple answer. Mera gari kahin nahi bikta. My car doesn't sell anywhere in the world. So it is the only market it sells. So I want to keep it close. A very, very simple answer. When it comes to
Thank you,
Amul,
Arpita.
very simple answer. And I'll just give you the last Amul part and I'll close and leave it to the others. The simple answer is that UK has banned imports of dairy, and we are not thinking about that. We have to look into the products that are banned on both sides, and maybe if we will get a different story. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arpita. I think we can probably Probably Dr. Kathuria, you can answer some of the questions.
No more from there.
I think no more for. There are some more.
Badri, I have.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sunita Raju
Please go
here.
ahead.
I have a couple of
Please go ahead.
observations. I mean, if you have time, I'll go ahead. Otherwise, it's okay. Do you
Maybe
have
you can
time?
keep it brief. You can keep
Yeah.
it brief.
I just have the two brief observations and two questions. I'll quickly run through them. We had in the presentation that the tariff level in the UK is lower and tariff level in India is higher. So the gains will obviously be for the UK market, in terms of the country. I just like to point out, see, that is the average. But then if you go down to the sectoral, if particularly the peak tariffs, you do have for in UK agro products, they have tariffs up to 240%. For chemicals it is 80%. So there are targeted ones out there. So I think a generalized observation in terms of the gains would be more. I would believe it would be too early to say that. And the other part of it is that, particularly if you see India's exports to UK, particularly the agri exports, they have been a decline in the last 10 years. It was in the export basket, 16% was agro product. In the latest year, it's about 8%. And I think one of the reasons is that the UK has got other preferential agreements with Iceland, EU, where they have, where they are exporting agri products to UK. And as a result of that, our access to the market has gone down. So unless and until the kind of the preferences they give match these preferences, I don't think we gain by bringing down the tariffs to a certain extent. Other thing is that the non-tariff barriers are extremely high in UK. And, we also know about the private standards out there, which are, which dominate the imports out there. So unless and until we draw upon some kind of benefits from them in terms of the MRAs and others, I don't think, the gains would be there in agri products to that question, in terms of this. One last question is that, like we've seen the engagement and agreements of the FTAs. The kind of the assessment is made is that, to what extent is, the post FTA, do we have the deficit increasing or the surplus increasing? I believe, it would be a short-sighted one, because if the deficit between the trading partner increases, but your exports to the world increase, which was proved by an article of RBI on the on the ASEAN FTA. After implementation of the ASEAN FTA, the trade deficit between ASEAN countries and India has increased, but India's export to the world has increased 4 times. So I think the parameters for making the assessment in terms of the success or failure or whatever we might say would depend on the context, would depend on the pointed objectives that we have. Particularly in the context of UK, I think we should gain in terms of the, like the presentation was made, they are high on innovations. So we should capitalize on that, and then if they ask for market access, it's a give and take, so we can't say that we will only take but not give it to you. So, we should know our priorities in case we want to improve our capability in terms of the manufacturing or exports, and then define the targets, and then identify what is it that we want from them. So that's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Smita. I think we can close the questions from the our audience because we are running short of time. Maybe Dr. Kathuria can give a brief response, and maybe some of the detailed questions can also be followed up later on bilaterally or email or in person.
Sure. Yeah, actually don't have much to say because I agree. So starting with what you said, Badri, and I'll also ask TG also to make any address any points that I may not, because I'm not going to actually, since I agree with most of what especially you and Harsh have said. Uh, this question on the STRI has, yes, we were alerted to it even earlier, and yes, there are some issues, but it's the only thing going around there, and I think you also mentioned you agree that, and both you and Harsh said that, the liberalization, and I think one can go deeper drill down and see where, in which particular sectors, which are especially important, which have a knock-on effect on exports and overall economic efficiency. Telecom is already something that India has done, but which other areas where there are still big gaps between efficiency? So banking is banking a sector, is insurance, is logistics a sector? These are things which huge knock-on effects on on exports. So we kind of agree there. Yeah, the issue of labor and environment costs, labor and environment standards, raising costs in the short term, that is true. Bangladesh faced that post Rana Plaza. They had an accord, and it was found that so all the factories had to. That was a part of the accord between the international buyers and the garment manufacturers. They all had to increase their capacity, worker safety. Many of them now are globally recognized green factories. So, but there is a short-term cost, and so what kind of mechanism, coming back to the point of collaboration, can there be sharing? Because this is, in a sense, this is a global public good, especially when it comes to the environment. These are global. So can there be some sharing there of and collaboration in that space? Yeah, I think, Harsh, the only reason why we mentioned that issue of anti-dumping was just to say that India was, that to illustrate the issue of protectionism, that India has been moving in the direction of protectionism. But then Badri pointed out that at least after 21, those actions have lost their steam. Rajesh, I think Arpita already answered the India-UK modeling exercise. We basically drew on that. There is really no reason to replicate that exercise. I think the work is already done, and you're getting the broad estimates from there, and they make intuitive sense. Whether protectionism of the last few years has harmed trade and growth, I have not. Maybe TG will want to say something to it. I do not have an immediate answer to it. I think it's something that we'd like to study further. This House of Lords work that you're citing, indeed, that's what we saw, and in fact mentioned in the presentation that there is some concern in the UK on the concerns with bureaucracy, policy uncertainty, and so on. The question from Anjali Tandon about Bangladesh already having a zero tariff. The point that we were trying to make, Anjali, was that after 26, when Bangladesh graduates from a least developed country, it is likely to be taken off especially in its biggest export, garments, which are 85% of its merchandise exports. In that sector, it may already, I don't know if it already is graduated in that particular sector, but if not, they will be graduated after becoming a low middle income country or graduating. So there will be some some of that trade, because in garments at least, the South Asian countries globally at least compete on at some level, even though there are there are regional value chains. That's one limited success story in South Asia in regional value chains is the apparel and textile value chain. So there's been some benefit there, but there'll be some trade moving to India because of this Indo-UK FTA, which can be, again, as I said, that you can have Bangladesh can then, and other countries can have early harvest deal with the UK to forestall that. And Arpita, we will come back to you. You've raised many points. You seem to obviously have a lot of detailed information, and we'd like to, touch base with you offline. So I think I will stop here and ask TG if you want to address anything.
I just want to make one point. It's about where does India's trade policy stand now in the recent years? Has it become more protectionist or not? See, as an outsider, one would think it has become definitely more protective. It's a battle of perceptions. Now, we do know that behind the border reforms have been done. So if you look at the latest World Trade Organization trade policy review, it's kind of neutral on it. There are behind the border reforms have been done, but at the border it has gone up. Maybe it's the way India wants to manage this signing of FTA, make it more incentive for bilateral FTAs by raising the general barriers. I don't know. I'm just making a wild guess here. But it's definitely a battle of perceptions. India's perception outside is that protection has gone up. Yes, making business within India is easier for the domestic industries, but exporting to India is probably continues to be harder for outsiders. So I just want to make that point. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can actually supplement. So even though I said, I'll speculate here that, again, notwithstanding what Harsh said, and yes, I perfectly agreed that India is still a lower middle income country, lot of gaps, lot of poverty, but it is a growing power. And in the future, not currently, in the future, there will be less and less asymmetric treatment. So when it comes to, on an MFN basis, if our tariffs are going up, right, by 5 percentage points, and that's massive because that conceals actually much more dispersion, because the other statistic that we mentioned, there is a lot more dispersion going on because of selective application of tariffs, which goes against, we know as trade economists, we know that's not good for overall and sort of finding new sources of export growth, that those things militate against that. So India's own history, world history, is basically you call for deep engagement. All the countries, any country in the world which is rich, of course there are many correlations, many correlates of that, but certainly low and relatively uniform tariffs, right? Perhaps with the exception of agriculture, because that's another baby altogether. But that's why we often talk of non-agricultural tariffs. But if you make that correlation, right, and the Growth Commission talked about this as well, that definitely all the rich countries of the world have relatively low, relatively uniform tariffs, right? So ASEAN countries, East Asian, which India often aspires to, their average tariffs are 2-3% on, and we are talking now, the latest numbers that we're talking about are what, 17-18% MFN, or no, sorry, 14% MFN. So that's a massive difference if you look at it in percentage terms, right? So I think, we can do deeper studies at a sectoral level, and hopefully we'll actually, this is something that we will want to do. But I think the broader point is that it cannot not hurt India's dynamism and continues. Yes, I know there are schemes, there is PLI, but PLI is coming up, remember, on the back of, there are tariffs behind that on many schemes. Will those be permanent? What will happen? I think there are dynamic questions that will come up, which we don't have answers to because perhaps it's a bit early in the game on PLI. But PLI cannot be a long-term answer to India's export dynamism or it's, taking its place in the sun as a global trading nation, right? So I think these are perhaps shorter term solutions. Yeah.
One very quick point on which will add to your benefit point. And I agree, PLI, in fact, PLI scheme is not devised as a long-term scheme. It is a time-limited scheme. And it cannot be an answer because it adversely affects innovation, etc. over time. But the point I was making is, India is in the global trade market competing with others. What is the situation of our main competitors? If you take a look, you just take a list of our main competitors, and for ease of reference, I'll take Vietnam because it has outcompeted us in two important sectors. Both of them now are being given PLI. Vietnam's exports, 65% of Vietnam's exports actually go to FTA markets, which means very low tariff. About 20% of India's exports go to our FTA markets. So here is a non-level playing field in which we are functioning. So the regaining the preference or whatever is getting rid of partly the preference erosion we are facing, that is the key reason for India going into FTAs. And the question is, do you want to go into FTAs? Do you not want to go into FTAs? If you don't go into FTAs, this non-level playing field will become more and more non-level. So a benefit of FTA is not only what is calculated in the conventional way, it is also how you are changing the evolving access to global markets and leveling the playing field. I had looked at the various competing economies. India has, with the top 20 importing economies, 4 FTAs. India is one of them. So 4 countries it had FTA. The lowest number any other country competing economy has is 7. And Vietnam has 16, and some have 14. So, and in a GVC context, the vibrant GVC place is Asia, which is South Asia, East Asia. Not South Asia, East Asia. And it's the FTA. If you really see how has, from 2001 when Vietnam's electronic exports were less than India, it has 9 times India's exports last year. So it's just that the gains are not only conventionally measured, you lose whatever gains you are likely to get if you don't play the game.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Actually, the point you mentioned, nicely resonates with the overall strategy. Like one of the discussion points we have whenever we talk about these FTAs is that more than what we gain from FTAs, the discussion is about how much would we lose if we don't have these FTAs. So that's the opportunity cost kind of thing. So thank you so much, and thank you very much, Dr. Kathuria and Dr. Srinivasan, for a wonderful presentation. It was very thought-provoking. Probably one of the most widely participated seminars we have ever had. So thank you once again for that, and thank you to all the participants, Dr. Chedda as well for the great questions, and the audience as well. And apologies to some of them who didn't get opportunities to ask questions. But everyone can feel free to contact us and Dr. Kathuria for. I hope that's fine for further follow-up discussions and so on. And also this event has been recorded now. It will also be on YouTube. So please feel free to share it widely for people who couldn't have attended this. And just one last observation I wanted to mention in response to Dr. Chedda's question about the CG modeling studies. In fact, we are doing some such studies here at NITI Aayog. On a real-time basis, we are working with the commerce to do these studies and provide inputs. And hopefully at some point they'll also be made public. But right now these are work in progress because we are directly working at the tariff line level, what is happening at the tariff line level and modeling them. Thank you for that question as well. So thank you, everyone. So we'll end the session now. And
Thank you to you and your team, to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.